I'm excited to see how closed captioning does with the accent.
We'll do as well as Siri does with your accent. So.
Hi, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started because it's 11 and we have so much to talk about today. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Janelle Jones, the Managing Director for Policy and Research at Groundwork Collaborative. I am so excited to be at Netroots at home to discuss taxing the patriarchy with this panel. I can't think of three other women better suited to walk us through this topic, tell us why it is important before COVID, and remind us why it's important now, and how it can ensure an economy that is prosperous for women. Alyssa is the National Director for National Budget and Taxes for Moms Rising. Her career has been focused on legislative and policy work in the field of poverty policy. She is crucial to so many campaigns on this issue that are human-centered and smart and good and successful. Amy is the Director of Income Security and Senior Counsel at National Women's Law Center. She works on a broad range of economic issues affecting low and moderate income women and families, with a special emphasis on federal and state policy. And Amy is often the person bringing together the intellectual rigor to meet on-the-ground advocacy in a way that furthers the goals for each. Chai Ching is the Senior Director of Economic Policy at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. She focuses on fiscal and economic effects of federal and budget policy. Is maybe one of the smartest people I know in life. I only know a tax policy is like good and progressive if Chai Ching has signed off on it. So we are just all so lucky to be able to talk to these three fantastic scholars and advocates for the next 50 minutes. A few housekeeping notes: to promote on social media and Facebook, use hashtag NN20. The session will be recorded, and please use the Q&A for questions as opposed to the chat. So before I turn it over to Chai Ching to make us smarter about taxing the patriarchy, I want to do a little moderator table setting about the economy and give some context for the conversation we'll have today. Given the state of current affairs, it might not seem timely to talk about taxes and tax policy, but it's actually a perfect time to evaluate the economic policies that have led us to where we are in the context of taxes. A thing I think we know now more than we did a few months ago is that the economy we had built prior to the coronavirus outbreak was broken. Millions of Americans, especially women and specifically women of color, were already struggling, living paycheck to paycheck with no sense of security or safety net for rainy days and emergencies. While the coronavirus outbreak tipped us over into our current economic downturn and public health crisis, we have to keep in mind that the economy was not doing well beforehand. Our economy has taken a massive hit, and it will take us a long time to recover. And there's four things quickly that I want to go through that have just made this much worse than it needed to be. The first is extreme inequality. Everyday workers and families were already struggling to purchase basic goods. This is even more true for women, as they are overrepresented in low-wage jobs that typically have unstable and irregular schedules, little to no benefits, and no PPE to protect themselves against a global pandemic. The second factor that made this worse is the erosion of worker power. Conservative policies have eroded collective bargaining and unions over the past few decades. And as a result, we have a labor market that's saturated with low quality jobs, which we now know we all need and are essential to the rest of us surviving. And Black and brown workers are disproportionately represented in these types of jobs. And the pandemic has really just put this on display as women of color, low-income workers are choosing between a paycheck and survival. The third and fourth factors that are a little bit more directly tied to what we're going to talk about today are austerity budgets and deregulation. Conservative trickle-down policies led to drastic and harmful tax cuts, which we will get into as we tax the patriarchy. Gotta make a plug for the shirt. It's a great shirt. Trickle-down economics has proven time and time again to lead to wealth hoarding, the opposite of prosperity for most of us. And as those at the top continue to amass wealth at the expense of the rest of us, the wealthy continue to influence lawmakers to perpetuate these vicious cycles. Neoliberalism has led to austerity budgets at the federal and state level, which have made us unprepared for both the current economic fallout and the inability to marshal a response. And so given how great we were all doing in all of that context, why should we and how can we tax the patriarchy? And so I'm going to start with Chai Ching to talk a little bit about, what are some of the revolution solutions given the fundamental structural flaws I've just laid out?
Awesome. That's amazing context. Thanks, Janelle. And I think that's exactly what we need to have in our heads when we're thinking about the tax code. There's just, with all of those problems, there is so much potential there for revenue solutions to move the ball forward. The federal tax code and state tax codes, they reallocate trillions of dollars in the economy every year. So how many trillions they reallocate and who they raise them from and where that money goes, that can have incredibly powerful impacts on equity if we center equity in making those decisions about the tax code. Now that topic is so big, it can seem really abstract. So I want to start by trying to kind of make it a little bit more concrete about why the need to raise progressive revenues is really an equity issue. So first, compared to 35 developed countries, you sort of look at Canada, UK, Australia, the Netherlands, all of those sorts of countries. If you take them and you rank them all, the US tax system overall is one of the smallest. It's in the bottom 4 of 35 developed countries in terms of how much revenue it raises compared to the size of the economy overall. And, why is that an equity problem? Well, one big reason, a main reason, not the only reason, but a big reason is that the reason that any country has a tax system at all is, of course, to support public investments. Now, that doesn't mean that every single dollar of public investments has to be paid for. And in fact, especially in a recession, you don't want to do that. But over the long term, guess what kinds of investments don't get made when revenues are unusually small? It's not national defense and military spending. The US is well above other countries in terms of how much it spends on those sorts of things. But I don't think it would shock anyone here to look at the types of spending that gets left behind when revenues are really small are the types of investments that have real potential to break down gender and racial barriers to economic success for women and women of color and people of color in particular. It's spending on things like parental leave and support for cash assistance for low-income families with children. It's things like early childhood education. All of those categories, the US is way below other countries when it comes to how much it invests in those priorities. So you end up in a situation where even outside a recession, only 1 in 6 low-income children who are eligible for childcare assistance get it, because we're spending so little on funding that really critical priority. So that's one big equity problem with the US tax system raising too little in revenues. Here's another really big important problem. And that is that taxes can advance equity, not just through the investments that they support, but also through choices about who pays the tax. Progressive taxes directly shrink income and wealth inequalities if they ask more from those at the very top of the income and wealth distribution. And of course, as Janelle noted, we've got this history of policies and practices, including in the tax system, that have set up barriers to economic success for women and people of color while privileging overwhelmingly white men who are disproportionately and overwhelmingly at the top of the income and wealth distributions. But here's why even a really progressive tax system that raises more from those at the top than those at the bottom in relative terms is not enough. I want you to imagine a tax code that raises every single dollar of revenue just from one person each year, the person at the top of the income and wealth distribution. And given what we know about the state of the economy, in any given year, on average, that person would be white and male. That's a really progressive tax system if you only tax that person. But if that tax system were really small, say it only raised $100 of revenue, then that's going to do virtually nothing to reduce income, racial, wealth, and gender disparities. And that's a key problem with the US tax code right now. Some folks like to point out that the federal income tax system is quite progressive relative to other countries. And if you just look at the federal tax code and ignore state tax codes, which are actually really regressive, that's true. But it does really little to reduce income and wealth gaps compared to other countries because it's so small. So we need to both raise revenue and the size of the tax code and the progressivity of the tax system in order to support investments and to directly reduce racial, gender, income and wealth gaps. All right, so here's one more aspect of the tax system that has really big equity impacts, and that's enforcement. It's a really important thing to be thinking about at a time when the nation seems ready for a conversation about who gets the protection of law and who doesn't, and who gets the laws enforced and who doesn't, and the ways that those decisions uphold really deep inequities. And when you're talking about tax cheating, by far the biggest amount of dollars that get evaded is happening from really high income and wealth people and businesses with complicated financial arrangements, armies of lawyers, offshore tax accounts, and all of those games that they can play to avoid taxes. And again, those people at the top of the income and wealth distribution are overwhelmingly and disproportionately white and male. But since 2010, deep budget cuts and the loss of expert IRS staff means that audit rates for the largest corporations have been cut in half. Audit rates for millionaires are down 60%, and criminal prosecutions and investigations of tax cheats, again, don't think sort of low and moderate income people or small businesses. This is like offshore accounts and really complicated international tax cheating. Those criminal prosecutions are also way down. And now that's led to a disparity where people that are low and moderate income and claim the earned income tax credit are audited at higher rates than those in the top 10% of the income distribution. So while the tax code overall is progressive and does raise revenue that supports really important investments that advance racial equity, it could do so much more if we raised more revenue, did so progressively, and enforced the tax laws on the books. And one really critical and promising way of doing that is to tax income from wealth much more effectively. A lot of that income currently escapes the tax system altogether. And if you know anything about the gender wealth gap and racial wealth gaps, and particularly the wealth gap between white men and women of color, you will sort of intuitively understand why better taxing and not allowing that income to escape the tax code could really help shrink those gender and racial inequities, both between those at the top and those at the bottom, and even those at the same income level, some of whom have access to the ability to build wealth and some who don't. So I'd love to talk more about the specifics of how we could do that. There's, again, this is a really timely conversation because there's a wealth of great ideas that are starting to bubble up around how we can do that. But there are some really complementary ways to improve our tax code that would better address dismantling barriers for women, people of color, and women of color. So back to you, Janelle, to move us along.
Chai-Ching, that was great. That was amazing, as I knew it would be. Amy, can you talk a little bit about why Chai-Ching's solutions are the way to go? Why is tax justice also racial justice, also gender justice? Like, what does the research say? What are advocates saying? How does that context help us to get to some solutions that Chai-Ching just pointed us to?
Thanks so much, Janelle. First off, I just wanted to say how excited I am to be on this panel with you and Chai-Ching and Alyssa to talk about how tax policy is integral to gender justice, because tax policy really shapes every facet of women's lives. As Chai-Ching just laid out, it raises revenues for shared priorities like childcare, education, even the roads that we drive on. It sets the rules that shape our economy. As Chai-Ching was saying, it affects kind of whether people can hoard wealth or whether we have a better path to shared prosperity. And it also contains policy choices to reward or disincentivize economic behaviors by individuals and families. And I want to spend a little time talking about what I mean by that. So a lot of people think that the tax code is neutral. It's just about numbers, it's pure math. You just apply a percentage to the amount of your income and there you go, taxes. But the tax code, like any other system or body of law, really reflects our values as a society. The 2017 tax law is a prime example. So Center on Budget and Groundwork and other great organizations kind of lifted up for the public how much the Trump tax cuts were skewed to benefit the wealthy and big corporations, especially those with sophisticated tax lawyers and kind of the wherewithal to game the system. But income levels are connected tightly to race and gender. Women who are supporting families on their own and households of color are overrepresented in lower income levels and thus lower tax brackets, and they're underrepresented in the higher tax brackets. So women and people of color are disparately harmed when tax policies like the 2017 tax law leave them out and benefit the wealthy. But on top of that, race and gender bias is really embedded in the tax code. As Chai-Ching mentioned, in terms of just like putting higher tax rates on higher levels of income, yes, the US tax code is progressive. But when you stop and think about kind of the way that the tax code defines families, defines imagines who is in the workforce, those are aspects that do reflect a great deal of race and gender bias. This is not surprising because the modern tax code was written in the early 20th century by privileged white guys. And so the policy choices in the tax code often fail to reckon with race and gender inequality, and they really don't reflect the lives of people in the 21st century. As you can imagine, if you had a senator with decades of intergenerational wealth passed down, the tax code that he wrote did not really reflect the life of a Black domestic worker in 1932 because it was not within the scope of his experience and imagination. That was not the perspective that he was bringing to writing the tax code. So the way that the tax code defines families, assumes who is in the paid workforce, envisions what a worker's typical career trajectory looks like, and imagines caregiving as a cost that every individual family takes care of on its own by its own family members, most of whom were women. This is reflective of the experience, worldview, and values of the white guys who wrote the tax code in 1939. So it's not shocking that, even over time, as the tax code has gotten adjusted and rewritten, many of the tax code's provisions leave out women and people of color, sometimes by inadvertence, sometimes by design. So one example I want to go through is kind of how the tax code treats childcare expenses people need to work. On the one hand, it's an economic value that you want to make it easier for people to go to work. People with children need to put them somewhere when they go to work. It is part of the cost of going to work. It's part of the burden that parents pay. And as we're seeing, a lot of that burden right now is placed on women. Since 1954, the tax code has provided tax assistance to people who have childcare costs to go to work. But when Congress was debating this particular type of tax assistance, they were actually worried about making it too generous. There were people in Congress who said specifically, we don't want middle-aged and assume white women whose husbands will not buy them a fur coat, decide that they want to go out to work and let their children run wild in the streets. This is what people were thinking about when they designed tax assistance for childcare. So the way that Congress structured the child care and tax provisions in 1954, they definitely succeeded in not making it too generous. They only provided a deduction that was capped. And even today, when millions of families around the country are struggling with the high cost of childcare, we are not really worried about the fur coat situation. There are so many more two-family income households. People need to go to work, especially single parents. So that's obviously a reality that was not contemplated in 1930 by the white dudes. So even in this time when people are struggling to meet the childcare costs, and we know now more than ever how critical childcare is to being able to go out into the paid workforce and make our economy go, right now, childcare tax benefits are structured in a way that higher income families get the bulk of them and lower income families are often left out. And as Chai-Ching mentioned, this is a huge problem, especially when you consider that only 1 in 6 eligible children receive childcare assistance because we simply do not fund it adequately. Childcare tax is just one example. The tax code leaves women and people of color out of a wide range of its provisions, whether it's the mortgage interest deduction, which is supposed to encourage home ownership, to retirement savings tax preferences, where we're supposed to, make it more, make your money work better after you have saved it to finance your own retirement, or other kind of wealth building things like education savings for college education for children or relatives. But because of this, the tax code can exacerbate and reinforce the barriers to employment, gaps in wealth and income, and contribute to these vast income and wealth gaps that women and people of color face every day. The thing is that it doesn't have to be like that. There are some provisions of the tax code that go far in advancing race, gender, and economic equity. I want to highlight 2 of those in particular. Tax benefits like the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit especially benefit women of color. They are targeted at low and moderate income workers earning under $60,000. They're more valuable for families with children. And if people don't have tax liability because their incomes are too low, they can receive a cash refund from these credits when they file their taxes. And what does that mean for families? So this is an income boost. Families can receive thousands of dollars in tax refunds from the Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit. And this can help either smooth income when people are receiving economic shocks like losing hours of work or their jobs in a recession. It can help narrow some of the income gaps that women, and especially women of color, face in the workplace. And we know that for families with children, it improves outcomes, health, education, future employment. It really lifts the well-being of all people in those families. So if we're looking to harness the power of the tax code to increase race and gender and economic equity, there are a number of solutions that get us there. First, we have to embrace the progressive revenue policies that Chai-Ching walked us through to make sure that we can invest in what women and communities of colors need to succeed in this and remake our economy. We need to double down on the tax benefits that we know increase race and gender equity. That means expanding the EITC and the child tax credit to refundable tax credits that we know especially benefit women of color. And we also need to make sure that if the tax code is lifting up certain economic behaviors like homeownership or savings or going to work and needing childcare to do that, we need to make those benefits available to the households who need them the most. And for all practical purposes, that means that we need to make them refundable credits so that families with low income, among whom women and people of color are overrepresented, can take advantage of those tax credits. And in addition, this may sound boring, but it's in fact super important. We need more comprehensive information about who benefits from the tax code's provisions and how much by demographics and not just by income levels. That way, policymakers can be sure that they are advancing tax policies that advance race and gender equity rather than reinforce the bad patterns of the past. And last but not least, we really need to make sure that we don't make it too hard or too complicated for low-income families to claim tax benefits. This is kind of the other side of the coin to what Chai-Ching was talking about tax enforcement. And in this sense, we need to make sure that the IRS is sufficiently funded and that volunteer tax assistance is available so that low-income households, women of color, families of color get help accessing the benefits that they're eligible for and just don't get audited on the back end. So I want to turn it back over to Janelle to kind of finish this conversation. I'm going to put a link in the chat to some reports that the National Women's Law Center did that walked through some of these policies with the help and assistance of many of the people on this panel. But with that, Janelle, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much, Amy. I obviously agree with all of that, except the idea that tax policy could be boring, because you are teaching me right now that it is not. It is crucial to justice. So that was great. Amy, you started to get into solutions. Alyssa, why don't you talk to us a little bit more about those solutions in the context of a progressive agenda and, you know, the global pandemic we're also currently facing. So big task ahead. Please do it in 10 minutes.
Yes. Yeah, I will solve all our world problems right now. So buckle up, everyone. So I really think that taxes and budgets are the thread that weaves throughout all of our progressive agendas, and we need to start thinking and talking about it in that way. And I know that, you know, like some of you might be coming to this issue for the first time, but hopefully we're gonna give you some examples of how you can kind of weave that in and why it does matter to a progressive agenda. You know, we're so often single issue focused, and that's okay. It's really important to have advocates and organizations dedicated to the promotion and passage of, say, like child care for all or defunding the police, the plethora of issues that are addressed over the next couple of days at Netroots. But we hope that you can kind of start to talk about how these programs are funded and the way that we build them to be more just and, you know, women and community of color center, and that the tax and budget piece of that is really central to how you kind of like move your policy along. And obviously we can't get anything that we want to accomplish without money. So I really think we should be talking about how we get that money in two different ways. So the first way is reallocating existing funds away from harmful and wasteful programs. And the second way is taxing the rich. So by defunding ICE and reallocating money away from, say, like the militarization of local police forces and not only overturning the Trump tax, but replacing it with a tax system that makes wealthy individuals and mega corporations pay for their fair share, we can create a lot of the policies that we want to create. Like by doing that, we are giving ourselves, you know, hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars in funds that we could use to create pre-K for all or free college tuition for low and moderate income students or free COVID vaccinations, you know, everything from how we treat immigrant families to healthcare and then some. So how does this all relate to like where we are right now in this very complicated moment? So obviously, you know, where we are with COVID, both the virus and the economic fallout is not a mistake. The fallout of the pandemic is what we could have controlled if we had a system that didn't for decades and centuries harm women and community of color. And obviously, if we had leadership that gave a damn. And I think that the historical nature was definitely well covered by Janelle and Amy in terms of like how we kind of got to this point and what policies led it that, you know, that 1 in 6 Black women are now unemployed and that this pandemic is hitting Black and brown families particularly hard, both from a health point of view, but also an economic point of view. But everything we're talking about today comes into play when we begin to look at the current negotiations or lack thereof for the next COVID package. Many of us, as well as Democrats, want a big, robust COVID relief package that places families and our economy first and addresses the multitudes of needs that still remain. Everything from $50 billion for childcare to an extension of the unemployment benefits to providing frontline workers, many of whom are, you know, immigrant women, with the PPE they're missing. And the last few packages have been historical in their size, but that's really what it takes to accomplish what we need to accomplish, which is bringing the country back from the edge of a economic recession and making sure our families don't fall through the cracks, and of course, putting an end to an aggressive virus. But after the Republicans signed off very quickly, like surprisingly quickly, on trillions of dollars in spending earlier in the pandemic, and of course, making sure that the boxes got checked for their industry bailouts they wanted and $135 billion, no strings attached, nothing to do with COVID, millionaires giveaway, they're all of a sudden pumping the brakes and lowballing the American people. And they're saying all this is in the name of deficits. I mean, they say a lot of different things, and most of it is, totally ridiculous, but the underlying theme of this is deficits. The reason we don't have a package passed at this point, besides the fact that, Mark Meadows went on vacation, and we're weeks past, obviously, the eviction moratorium deadline and the expiration of the UI benefits, is because we have people like Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley and Mark Meadows who continue to push this decades-old talking point about austerity and deficits and how tax cuts stimulate the economy, not spending on programs that lift up families and workers. The Washington Post recently called this group born-again fiscal conservatives because just a few years ago, as we mentioned, they had no problem passing a tax cut for mega corporations that cost the American people trillions of dollars and did nothing to stimulate the economy or create more jobs. So we have money to spend to help families in our economy during COVID, and economists, even moderate and right of center economists, say like now is the time to be spending federal dollars. Now is when it's especially okay to run a deficit, since it will stop the bleeding and hopefully limit the duration of the recession. I would go as far as to say that now is the time to raise taxes on the rich. When Moms Rising members found out about this millionaires tax giveaway that was snuck into the CARES Act, they were outraged when they saw that this had, nothing to do at all with COVID, and yet they still were fighting for, PPE, face masks, et cetera, for frontline workers and nurses and stuff. They were really pissed off. And I would bet good money that polling would show right now that people are in favor of taxing the rich in order to get the unemployment, nutrition, healthcare programs that they need right now. Especially because there's been a lot of articles written about, who's making money off of this virus, like the Amazons of the world and such. So this moment we're living in is unique in many ways, but not necessarily in the battles we're facing around taxes and spending. The racial justice moment we're finding ourselves in is important, obviously, in so many ways, but perhaps surprising in one regard, at least surprising to me. It's the first time in a long time that the wider public is starting to look at how our tax dollars are spent and whether or not they should be spent that way. They're starting to examine not just how large certain police force budgets are, but instead of saying, we should cut portions of that altogether, they're identifying that pot of money for specific programs they want to reallocate it to. So affordable housing programs, social emotional learning programs for Black and brown children, free school lunch, et cetera. And, a lot of the times prior to that, we would just say, like, a lot of people in the public would say, oh, that's wasteful spending, or we don't want our money spent that way. But they weren't doing this, trade-off reallocation conversation. And I think that's a very important place where we've moved the public along. And obviously the polling for defunding the police right now versus where it was like a year ago, I mean, it's a major shift in public support and thought. And that's, amazing right now. And we should really be digging into that and continuing that. The big talking point that we've been leaning into at Moms Rising is the fact that more schools have police officers in the school than a nurse or a school counselor or a social worker. So we want to get the cops out of the schools because that's a major component of the school to prison pipeline. And then we want to reallocate those funds to hire those nurses and the counselors that our kids, especially Black and brown children, really, really need. So Moms Rising created an explainer video about defunding the police, and I'm going to drop the link into the chat because I think that this shows some ways of kind of how you weave tax and budget language into a wider conversation, like the movement for Black Lives Matters. And obviously, you know, I'm more than happy to help folks if they need a way to kind of work in that language. So now and over the next few months is the exact time I think that we should be capitalizing on this national conversation about investments, because not only do we have an election coming up, but I also think we have the attention of the American people. They are really starting to evaluate the way that their government has failed them, the way money is being spent. And, you know, as progressives, we would say, like, in where we'd want to move those people is like, what is needed to make big structural changes in healthcare and schools and workplaces and the justice system, and how to make everything, including our tax system, less racist and sexist. And we're going to have to push our elected leaders to reallocate those funding away from harmful and wasteful institutions and put an end to tax cuts for the rich and the mega corporations. So I think that this is like a really good time to have this conversation, and a really great way to kind of weave it into the progressive causes that you all, you know, are working on so hard. So I'll turn it back to Janelle.
That was great, Alyssa. And Alyssa touched on this a little bit, but I'm wondering if Chai-Ching or Amy, you have thoughts. You know, as Alyssa perfectly explained, you know, we are facing a pandemic and an economic downturn. State and local budgets specifically will face significant shortfalls for months and years to come. And so why is austerity economics, like, you know, the idea that the deficit matters, that we can't spend money, like, why? I mean, I'm having flashbacks to it from the last recession. And I know it's already just like on the tip of a moderate Democrat's tongue right now. Why is this like not the choice? Like, why should we not be paying for anything right now? I obviously have some strong thoughts, but please tell me yours.
Well, I mean, so let me take two aspects of that. I mean, the state budgets, they are the ones, unfortunately, due to their constitutional requirements to have balanced budgets, that can't borrow. So they do have to balance their budgets. And that is why the federal government should step in with state fiscal aid to let them continue to be hiring teachers and public health officials and all of the, you know, all of the people that sort of make communities work, and not have to lay off people and deliver a second round hit to the economy. That should be happening, absolutely. The federal government really should step up. We are seeing some members of Congress being very resistant to that. So if the federal government doesn't come through with 100% of what states need, they are going to have to make choices about their budgets. And one of the really best choices that they can make is raising revenues from high income people. That would have one of the least harmful effects on the economy as it recovers, and protect investments, again, in things like childcare and early education that are really important to states' futures. And that is the same reason why the federal government should not be worried at this time. They have the fiscal space to run deficits in order to address the economic crisis. The harm to households who are the economy, I've got the t-shirt to show it, people are the economy, the harm that would be inflicted on people, workers, children, the damage to infrastructure, the damage to investments from premature austerity would hurt the long run recovery of the economy. And having low deficits when you have a really weak economy is not a good outcome. You can have deficits, and you can run deficits that are manageable as a share of the economy. So making the investments now to keep the economy strong actually helps those long run deficits be manageable. So this is not the time to be worrying about that sort of austerity language. I think particularly relevant for this group, you know, one of the austerity talking points we hear a lot is that we should be worried about saddling future generations, the kids and the grandkids, with debt. Well, you know, guess who is going to be hurt the most if we fail right now to invest in the areas that we need to invest in to ensure that kids are able to keep learning through this pandemic until we get to the end of that, to ensure that they have access to broadband in cases where schools aren't able to go back, to to do all the things that we need to do to make sure that households are able to survive financially. It is kids, it is grandkids, the next generation, who are going to be feeling the costs of this going forward if we don't step up with federal fiscal support. But once we recover, there will be a time to be thinking about how do we sort of support that longer term investment that we need to have been making, so that we didn't face such a fragile state when we have a crisis like this. And that's where we also need to be thinking about the revenue side, both to address those inequalities, but also to support investments.
I co-sign everything always that Chai-Ching says, but I also want to just kind of add one more thing to that, and that is, right now we are seeing families and people with an unprecedented level of need. People cannot put food on the table. People are worried about getting evicted because they can't pay rent. When you put money in people's pockets, whether it's through unemployment insurance benefits or through direct payments, tax provisions like the refundable tax credits, that money goes back into the economy and helps stimulate it. So that is one thing that we know: when you put money in people's hands for families that are struggling and facing need, they put that money back in the economy, and that is what helps stimulate it. So let's not artificially limit people's budgets or cut off what people need to eat and have a shelter, because that actually is going to help move our economy forward out of recession in a time when that's what we need, not kind of artificially limiting people's budgets.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, progressives are often right on the moral grounds, but I think the thing that we have to just keep saying is we are also right on the economic grounds. We are economically right as well, not just because we care about people. An audience question that I think is really good, anyone can answer. Could you speak to the generational impact, how millennials and Gen Z have been failed by tax and budget policy? And do you have a good explainer video? I think Chai-Ching touched on this a little bit, but Chai-Ching, more thoughts or thoughts from anyone else?
We should make an explainer video. Thanks for the idea. But I mean, I think the biggest failure right now is the inadequate response to this recession. I mean, the research shows that the people that face the long run hits on their earnings, on their ability to afford the basics and to afford moving up the ladder of economic opportunity, are those who are earlier in their careers and are entering the labor force at a time that a recession hits. So right now, the biggest budget failure is the failure to step up on adequate relief to households and states. But beyond that, I mean, I think millennials and Generation Z have been failed by those underinvestments in the raft of areas that we talked about, where the US is just sort of a laggard compared to other countries. Education, early learning, all of those things that really are investments in people and the future of the economy. And we should fix that. We should fix that by raising revenues from the wealthier generations. There's definitely a generational issue with that as well. One of my colleagues, Lily Batchelder, had a great piece that talked about how our failure to tax wealth, including inherited wealth, means that there is just billions that is going to be passed down from baby boomers to their heirs within really rich families, that is not being captured by the tax system and not being put forward to investments that would lead to shared prosperity. So that's another way that we can move forward.
I think, as an elder male, I'm at the very top of the millennial. I'm like the oldest group of millennials. Millennials especially have basically lived through 2 recessions at this point. And that's been when they've been trying to build their career and start a family. It's not avocado toast. It's the economy, stupid. It's the fact that we have systemic problems throughout built into our economy that has made it very difficult, especially for women of color, to kind of build the traditional career that we were taught as children of what you're supposed to do, that you enter into the workforce and you move your way up and you get steady raises. You know, a lot of people like got laid off early on in their career, couldn't find a job. So then they went maybe back to school because we also were told this myth. And then we took on even more debt because we thought we had to get graduate degrees and, you know, blah, blah, blah. So I think that, you know, those are also the families that are getting hit very, very hard by COVID right now. And CAP, Center for American Progress, came out with this great piece just yesterday talking about how the pandemic is basically forcing millennial women out of the workforce, that because we haven't had investments in childcare and paid family leave, and now they're basically having to decide, like, do I take care of my young child at home? Do I do my job? How do I balance it? You are going to see a very large amount of women, a generation of women, leaving the workforce because the government is basically forcing them to do so at the time when we are supposed to be at our largest earning power. So it's unfortunate that our reproductive years are also at the time when we're supposed to be building our career and all of that. So I think that, you know, this is obviously a very important piece, and the research is continuing with this. And I think it's really important research. You know, the other thing I'll say is, like, we need more women, especially women and women of color of the millennial generation, to run for office at all different levels. And that is the way that we are going to get these tax and budgetary, you know, solutions that we want, because it will be the people with the lived experience in the positions of power, instead of, like, you know, 80-year-old white guys who had nannies and all this stuff, who don't even know, like, what is childcare? How does that work? You know? And so I think that, you know, I'm hoping that what comes out of this is not just a bunch of people leaving the workforce and it creating economic collapse in their households, but then there's also a movement to move those very talented women into positions of power so they can start passing the policies that prevent this from happening the next time, because there will be a next time, and we need to make sure that that safety net is there, especially for, you know, women in their 20s, 30s, and 40s.
Agreed. I was looking for, like, you know, sometimes you can do like the clap hand emoji like in Zoom, but apparently we cannot at Netroots, which is fine. But I was looking forward to do it. One other question. So, you know, we've been talking about this in the context of COVID, which we're experiencing right now. What are some examples of using the economic response to COVID as an opportunity for making the tax system work for women? We talked a little bit about the ITC. Alyssa's very upset about this giveaway that happened in CARES. You know, was CARES overall a good example or a bad example? And what should we be looking for?
I mean, I'll say real quickly, like, you know, CARES overall there was a lot of very good that was in it, obviously, like a lot. And, you know, expanding what our unemployment system looks like, you know, that wasn't just, like we rebuilt in overnight unemployment insurance program, and we rebuilt it in a way with all its pains to greatly benefit women and women of color and the types of jobs women and people of color do that traditionally wouldn't allow for you to get unemployment insurance. We greatly expanded on a bipartisan basis paid family leave, which we've never had a bipartisan two-chamber vote on something like that. But there's like a lot of crap in it too, right? Because this was written over a week and a half, 2-week period. And we didn't really realize until it was passed and too late that the Republicans snuck this $135 billion millionaire giveaway. And it has nothing to do with COVID. I mean, these guys are getting such a windfall. Like 3 years ago, they got the Trump tax cut, and now they're getting this. Like, it's awesome. I keep thinking of like the Scrooge McDuck, you know, swimming around in coins, because like that's what they're going through. Meanwhile, a lot of people are like trying to figure out how to put food on the table. So when you think about like $135 billion, what could we do with that if we repeal it in the next package? Like, we could fund the $50 billion we need to save our childcare infrastructure and then some. Like, there's so much we can do with it. And I know Chai Ching is going to shine some light on like the other crap, basically.
Well, I try not to be too pessimistic. I mean, look, Janelle mentioned the structural inequalities that you come in with. You come in with poverty rates for women of color higher, far higher than for white men. The good news about the CARES Act is that while poverty rose overall, it managed to be sort of well-directed, well-targeted overall because of things like the UI provision, that it prevented those gaps in poverty rates from growing even further. Okay, so it stopped there from being even greater inequality in that sense than there would have been otherwise. But like Alyssa said, there are also lots of things that were put in there that are a really good example of what not to do. And one example, I think, of why our tax feminism has to be intersectional, otherwise it's not good tax feminism. Or another way to put it is Janelle's fabulous tagline, "Black woman best," could have been applied to this provision and ended up with a better example. There was a provision in the CARES Act that allowed for the purposes of flexible spending accounts and health savings accounts for menstrual products to be part of the expenditures that qualify for that tax break. So that sounds good, sort of, superficially from a sort of a feminist standpoint. That sounds kind of reasonable. If you're able to sort of get tax-free spending on all these other types of health related things, then that's a good thing too, right? Well, 70% of saving and spending through those accounts is by people with incomes above $100,000 a year. Those are not women who are experiencing period poverty. So you've got this provision that effectively does tax feminism for wealthy white women. And there are a lot of other things where you could have better spent or better targeted relief with those dollars. And I think it's a really sort of good example of the things we should be watching out for as we seek to sort of remake the tax code in a way that is furthering gender equity, but especially furthering intersectional equity. Another example is sort of looming. President Trump has just floated a tax cut on capital gains. Again, it's a tax cut on income from wealth. So if you wanted to target a tax cut to really wealthy white men who are predominantly older, that would be a good place to start. It would only benefit the top 1% of filers. So some cautionary tales that continue to be calling us to sort of act to stop things from getting worse, in addition to pushing forward on policies that would make things better.
So I think just to kind of put a fine point on that, like going forward, if we're not intentionally following the money and seeing where it goes and making sure that the people who benefit from tax provisions are women, people of color, and kind of the families who need it most. So kind of looking at this intersection of race, gender, and income in a really thoughtful and intentional way, then we're not taking advantage of the opportunity to make the tax code advance race and gender equity. So I think we need to be thoughtful, we need to follow the data, we need to kind of base it on what we know about the kind of income levels and what families are facing. And we can target and tailor our tax policies directly to that rather than just like throwing cash to the winds and hoping the rich people will save us.
That was a great closing thought. We are over time. Just quick closing thoughts, and it has to end with "Rich people won't save us." That's the only way to close now.
I'm gonna steal Janelle's closing thoughts. Black women best in the tax code as well as other places. I think that'll put us on the right path in tax policy.
Alyssa, closing thoughts?
I think the closing thought is to, pick up this mantle, weave it into the work that you're doing, follow the money. I always say, like, be the money, honey, like, tell them where you want the money to come from in order to accomplish your goals.
That was great. I mean, obviously, I could talk to these three for hours about why and how to tax patriarchy. Sadly, I cannot, as I've been told. As usual, I've learned so much during this conversation, and am even more hopeful about the ability for tax policy to be a tool in the fight for gender and racial justice. On behalf of myself, Alyssa, Chai-Ching, and Amy, thank you so much for joining us. And a reminder to promote, use hashtag NN20. And the session was recorded. That's it. Stay safe. Take good care. Happy Netroots.